When it comes to the New York City subway, there are a lot of reasons to complain. We have one of the dirtiest metro systems in the world and trains that you can pretty reliably expect to be unreliable. It's been 7 decades since our last major expansion, and the current one is breaking records for its price tag. But to act like this is solely what the subway deserves to be judged on would be ridiculous. How I personally feel, and how a lot of other New Yorkers probably feel as well, is that even though we might be impressed by other metro systems such as Mexico City, Moscow, or Stockholm, and be rightly told that ours sucks in a lot of ways, it simply has too much value as part of the identity of the city that in spite of how much we hate it, there will always be a certain part of us that is proud of it for the cultural significance. So as a celebration of this very special means of transportation, in this video we are going to explore 2 sides of New York's subway culture. One is the everyday etiquette and social space experienced by the millions of riders who commute daily for school and work, and the other is the underground culture of graffiti writing, which flourished during the 1970s. Thomas Wolfe's 1935 poem, Only the Dead Know Brooklyn, starts with the line, "There's no guy living that knows Brooklyn through and through, because it'd take a guy a lifetime just to find his way around the goddamn town." Although Wolfe was not born in Brooklyn, his years spent in the city gave him a very accurate representation of a typical New Yorker's attitude toward the subway. When asked for directions, the poem's narrator gives quick and confident instructions about where to transfer and which stop to get out at. And when interrupted by a different guy who gives completely different directions, he asks, "Oh yeah? How long you been living here?" Despite all his competitiveness in giving directions, the narrator himself does not claim to know the borough or its subway through and through, and is instead freaked out when he realizes that the person who asked for directions has nowhere specifically to go, but just wanted to go to Bensonhurst to explore because he liked the sound of the name. Apparently, he has the goal of exploring every single neighborhood of Brooklyn, and this was enough by itself to convince our narrator that he was crazy. Even written 85 years ago, I think the poem does a very important thing that hasn't changed up until today. It shows that for the vast majority of city residents, the subway is a way to get from point A to point B, and not a thing to be explored on its own. With 472 stations and 250 miles of track, it's understandable that the subway system, much like Brooklyn itself, is simply too big for anyone to know it in its entirety, except the dead, of course. This means that the mark of an experienced subway rider is an extreme level of familiarity with their own neighborhood and the commutes and recreational trips that they take throughout the year, while the system as a whole is resigned to the unknown, too chaotic and too big to be reckoned with. There is a great unspoken rule on the subway. Never look at other people for too long. You might be allowed to glance at them for a moment, but in general, you are meant to perceive them as a crowd rather than individuals. As Michael Brooks notes in Subway City, Riding the Trains, Reading New York, an individual forced into uncomfortable proximity to strangers responds by creating a private space of their own. Sometimes this is done by posture, sometimes by reading a newspaper or retreating into a world of thought. Those who wanted to understand the subway crowd had to violate the decorum. Maybe that means that children are the ones who understand the subway best, because they have not yet learned the correct etiquette. I have many childhood memories of my dad getting angry with me or my brother for getting out of our seats, talking loudly, or pointing at people on the subway. Although I still think as a parent I would have been more lenient, I understand how important parents feel it is to instill in their children the proper subway etiquette with the hope of preserving the peace that they themselves have become accustomed to. However, it's not just that this sort of antisocial environment is all bad, because admittedly it does allow people to have a great degree of choice over how to spend their time in their own private bubbles. For example, here we have an entire Instagram account with over 1 million followers entirely dedicated to pictures of attractive men reading books on the subway, something that would probably not be so possible both on the part of the reader and the picture taker in a more social subway culture. On the more comedic side, we have this guy here who makes videos performing in the subway, but not in the way you'd expect.
Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is a song that is very near and dear to my heart. I hope you all appreciate it and are touched by its words. never fucked Wayne, I never fucked Drake. All my life, for fuck's sake. If I did a menage with them, let them eat my ass like a cupcake. Let him eat my ass like a cupcake.
The truth is, this dude might be seen as more crazy than funny if this was in the middle of the street. But on the subway, a theater with a captive audience devoutly committed to silence and politeness in their commute to or from work, he comes in to brutally shatter these norms, screaming at the top of his lungs, but with a good sense of humor, of course, and it's hard for people to not enjoy that. So far in this video, we have taken a look at some aspects of what we could call the social environment of the everyday subway rider, of the commuter. But even in the underground, there is a world hidden deeper, one that nowadays is not so often seen until you look to the darkest, least accessible places, like the tunnels, where from the train car you can see illuminated, every inch tagged with aerosol spray. There was a time, however, when graffiti both literally and figuratively reached the surface, and could be found covering hundreds if not thousands of subway cars. This was the 1970s. Crime was rising, buildings were burning, and in places such as the Bronx, anyone who had the means was trying to get out. Meanwhile, the subways were in their worst state yet. In his 1979 article on the subway of New York, Nathan Glazer argued that subway riders made an unconscious connection between the visual assault of graffiti and more serious crimes like robbery, rape, assault, and murder. It may have been true that graffiti on the trains was the least of anyone's concerns at the time, but it was one of the best indicators that the city was in a state of chaos and abandonment, and no one liked being reminded of that. According to Glaser, graffiti thus became a crime that was relatively trivial, but whose aggregate effects on the environment of millions of people were massive. Taking all this into consideration, it's no wonder that year after year, the city government searched for ways to clean its subway cars. Meanwhile, the graffitiists themselves were looking at their actions with a completely different frame of reference. In The Death of Graffiti, Postmodernism and the New York City Subway, Claudia Barnett writes, "What some considered art, others considered crime. The writers themselves, however, considered it neither. It's no coincidence that while many critics referred to them as either artists or vandals, they preferred the innocuous term writers. Their reasons for writing were neither aesthetic nor antisocial. Graffiti was a very inward-facing culture. As much as the mayors tried to demonize graffiti writers, the truth is that the majority of them weren't doing the writing to terrify or to entertain the broader public. Rather, it was all about communicating to the other graffitiists and building a reputation for themselves. While everyone else was riding the subway as a means of transport and worried about the decadence of the city, graffitiists were simply playing an entirely different game that saw cars primarily as a canvas and as a path to underground fame. This attitude is represented in this well-known scene from the 1982 documentary Wild Style, featuring a kid who makes whole car pieces, which of course take much more time than a simple tag, but are guaranteed to get many more eyes and maybe even draw more kids into the graffiti world.
Society should go down in the subway and lock them all up because they don't have any business down there. It is dangerous down there. People that work down there 25 and 30 years have accidents. But his contention is that he's immortal, I guess, like most 17-year-olds are immortals, right?
It's a matter of getting a tag on each line and each division. You know, it's called going all city. People see your tags in Queens, uptown, downtown, all over.
I can only laugh to keep from crying because what happens is that I don't really think he knows how silly that sounds. He's going all city. I mean, to what end? And when I ask him, he says to me, well, just so people see it and they know who I am. Nobody knows who he is, and so they see it. And so
No, it's not.
The name of the documentary comes from another important part of graffiti, Wild Style, the unique font that acts as just another part of its exclusive, codified nature. Although graffiti would eventually end up fading with the success of the Clean Car program and a variety of other factors, the truth is that I still don't have a clear opinion on who was right when graffiti reached its height in the 1970s. Should it have been treated as a crime or a respectable cultural institution? It's simply impossible to say who was right because the perspective of the rider is worlds apart from that of the writer. The typical rider, as we've discussed, sees the subway car as a means to an end, as a way to get from point A to point B. But they also see it as a place of order, a place where privacy, even to the point of social isolation, is respected. Graffiti was the symbolic embodiment of all that going wrong, of the subways and their social order breaking down. Meanwhile, for the graffitiists, all of this is flipped on its head. It is a chaotic medium of expression that thrives in places where it cannot be pushed into submission. The cobwebs and ivy that grow in an abandoned building also symbolize its abandonment, but they are as much a part of the process of decay as they are a way for living beings to thrive in such circumstances. One of the childhood memories that sticks with me the most to this day is looking out through the subway window and seeing the tunnel zoom by me as the car itself seemed to remain still, only shaking every so often. No matter how often you tell yourself that it is in fact you who are moving, there is no way to perceive it differently as long as you sit in that car. Albert Einstein's theory of relativity was a revelation for physics, introduced over a century ago, that continues to form the basis for our understanding of the world today. One of the most mind-blowing parts of the theory is summed up like this. Since there is no absolute reference frame in relativity theory, a concept of moving doesn't strictly exist, as everything may be moving with respect to some other reference frame. Stillness is something experienced by all subway riders, and is not just physical but also a social stillness, one that stays intact no matter how stressed or calm each rider is in their own head. From the perspective of the car, graffiti is a physical feature, maybe a vibrant one or a terrible one, but one that forms a permanent part of the subway environment nonetheless. To the graffiti writer watching the train from the outside, graffiti is itself the movement, the message, the ticket to fame among the legends of the underground world. Yet all the while, without the knowledge of either of them, the spirit of graffiti moves on its own.